Yeah, it's very standard. Philosophers are disagreeing with each other, which
Yeah,
is
that's
great.
right.
Um, so I want to talk about a few individuals who are known as incompatibilists. Um, kind of they're quite common or quite popular within certain frames or kind of reams within sort of either philosophy or theology, etc. So I'm thinking of people like Sam Harris or Robert Sapolsky, or even someone
Hmm.
like Alex O'Connor, who's also known as Cosmic Skeptic online. There are others in this kind of popular space as well that are basically incompatibilists, saying that we can't have free will and be determined. And they kind of argue for determinism on a few sort of levels. So I'll kind of run through those now. So there's our sort of neurological makeup. There's the causation given the laws of nature. And they also argue for this through things like meditation. So Sam Harris would be quite common with this one, sort of recognizing that we don't control what we think or feel or hear next. It just kind of appears
Hmm.
to us. So there's no sort of us initiating those stances, so to speak. Could you explore kind of some of these areas, and then kind of I think it'd be good to understand kind of how these popular incompatibilist talking points kind of play in. So you've got kind of the psychological makeup, you've got nature, which we've already discussed a little bit, but we've also got kind of psychological makeups as well. So there's these three areas that I guess are kind of fronted or put out onto this sort of table to argue for incompatibilism. And it'd be good just to
Hmm.
get your take on some of those popular areas.
Yeah, that's interesting. And I've read some Sapolsky, some Harris, just a little bit here and there. I haven't read everything that these authors have written. What I find, though, from what I have read, and this is consistent with what I see in reviews of their work by folks like Al Mealy and John Martin Fisher, who I've studied with, and both have done a lot of work on free will and science. A lot. It's not uncommon for these, especially popular writers, to assume incompatibilism, to assume that determinism is a threat to free will, undermines it, and then to spend a lot of their energy kind of showing why, at the very least, certain of our behavior is determined by certain antecedent causes. Um, so if we'll get to this in a bit when we start talking about different compatibilist views and reasons for being a compatibilist. If you're sort of assuming there are no viable compatibilist views kind of from the get-go, like folks like me and a lot of other people in the free will debate are just not going to be moved because we don't see compatibilism as a non-starter. But that said, I think it is interesting to look at developments in science. And Sapolsky, I've looked more recently at Sapolsky's work. It's been a while since I've looked at Harris's, but there are some interesting developments in neuroscience, especially, that seem to show that less of what we think about, less of what we choose and end up doing, is under our kind of volitional, voluntary control than we might have initially thought. Um, and I think that does press us to say, well, how could we really be in control? How could it be up to us what we do if it looks like all these other things that we're not aware of, or that are coming from stuff in our genes? Like, if that's really what's pulling the strings, it looks like it's not up to us, it's not our agency. Um, at the end of the day, I'm not convinced by any of the sort of threats here that we don't have any control or agency or enough to be morally responsible. But I do think this will tell you a little bit more about my approach kind of in general. Is I think it does help us to look at these threats to free will and think about things like issues of luck and be a little bit more humble about our causal contribution, how much is up to us. I don't think that's a bad thing, but I also think it doesn't take us all the way to, well, we're never free. We're never responsible for what we do. Um, yeah, I could go into a little bit more detail, but without having specific kind of arguments or claims from Harris or Spolsky or others on the table, I think, yeah, I think people who are interested in that sort of thing could read, say like Fisher's review of Sapolsky's work. He's published in popular media, and also he wrote a review of the recent book on, I think it was Notre Dame Philosophical Reviews. People can find this online if they do a search.
Yeah, so it was a really interesting review. And I think you're right. I think there is just that assumption that incompatibilism is true. I think there's kind of almost like a public versus sort of philosophical stance where the public world kind of sees free will versus determinism, and that's sort of all there is.
Yeah.
These two things are at loggerheads all the time. But it seems to me from the literature and from those that I speak to that most, obviously not all, but most philosophers kind of hold a compatibilist view. Why? It'd be interesting to briefly kind of step back and ask, why do you think there is such a divide? Like, why is in the public space it's free will versus determinism, and within sort of kind of philosophical spaces in universities and in sort of different podcasts and groups that are knowing the literature and the academic research on this, there is this compatibilist view held. Like, why is there such an opposing force between these two things?
That's a very good question. I wish I knew the answer to it. I have some hunches, some guesses. I think it's hard for people to understand what determinism is. Like, even from my description of it a minute ago, I mean, no one would be at fault for not following. Like, it takes kind of a lot of focused thought on the implications of, natural law, what it means for the world to be in a certain state at a time, how that could kind of necessitate, a state of the world at the time after that, and so on. Like, it's just not the way we normally think about things. It feels very academic, maybe a little bit too speculative or something. I don't know. But when we try, especially when philosophers try to spell out what determinism is for students or for people that were polling with survey questions about determinism and free will, I think people can add into what we're saying is involved in determinism and think of it as more threatening than it might be. Now, maybe not. Maybe there's just like, among people who haven't studied philosophy, haven't thought about free will in that kind of context, maybe there's just this commitment to libertarianism, or at least to incompatibilism, the idea that determinism would preclude free will. But I tend to think, like, if you, and it's sort of hard to tell this from surveys, but like, if you give people more time with, a definition of determinism, thinking through its implications, distinguishing it from other things that very clearly eliminate freedom and responsibility, like, I don't know, acting under compulsion or due to hypnosis or something like that. If you're able to distinguish kind of mere causal determinism from these sorts of influences or compulsions on our agency, maybe we'd find that, people wouldn't say, oh, I see, it's not free will versus determinism. But I don't know. I guess it's sort of hard to tell. Maybe some of it's that. Maybe another thing that I sometimes think is that just people are often introduced to the term free will in a context where it is like pitted against determinism, or they're just introduced to the terminology as you either pick free will or determinism. And I don't know, this is one complaint I have against people like Harris and Sapolsky. They can sort of make that more widespread with their big platforms if they're assuming incompatibilism. That I think more and more people will just use the terms that way, free will versus determinism, without even sort of thinking about the possibility of compatibilist view.
Yeah, and one of the things I find a little bit frustrating, especially when you look at the sort of neurological makeup that we all have, is when you begin to try and replicate certain experiments with different people groups in different areas, you get different results. It's not always the same. I think it's known as the replication crisis. Kind of quite a few sort of scientific experiments that have been done under sort of kind of like controlled settings. When somebody's come back to it later on to try and repeat it, they've come to different findings essentially. And it's almost that you need so much data to be able to plot and understand where the sort of average is. And if you just do one or two little experiments, it could be either end of the spectrum, right? You need that bell curve to be able to understand where things kind of outlie and where things are much more in the average. If you enjoyed this clip, then head on over to Locals to access the full conversation right now. Supporters can access the video version, and everyone can access the audio-only version of the conversation. I'll see you over there.